At a research base in the Arctic, a sudden disaster is spreading quietly. A mysterious mutated virus has broken out. People infected with this virus will have their bodies gradually fester, and eventually shed strange black blood, suffering immensely. So far, this disaster has already infected 3 people, 2 of whom have unfortunately died, and the situation is extremely critical. In order to find out the cause of the virus as soon as possible, under the order of the military, the Atlanta Centers for Disease Control and Prevention decided to send a team of 4 elite experts, led by Alan, to the Arctic base to carry out the mission. At first, Alan was filled with doubts. He couldn't understand why he was chosen for this mission. After all, there were many experienced experts at the CDC. That was until he learned that the only surviving one among the 3 infected people was actually his own biological brother, Peter. All his doubts vanished in an instant. He agreed to take part in the mission without hesitation. In addition to Alan, Julia, Sarah, and Doran also participated in this mission. On the way to the Arctic base, Sarah learned a hidden secret. Julia and Alan had been married before, but they later divorced, and the reason for the breakdown of their marriage was a ridiculous relationship that had existed between Julia and Peter. This news was like a stone creating ripples in everyone's hearts. Soon, the plane they were on arrived at the Arctic Research Base. Dr. Sonata from the base warmly received them. Later, the staff injected access chips into their hands, which allowed them to move freely around the base. The group took the elevator to the laboratory built underground. Because Alan was worried about his brother's condition, he decided to enter the isolation room with Julia first to check on Peter. As soon as they entered the isolation room, they were shocked by the sight in front of them. Peter's condition was extremely critical, with black blood vessels covering his entire body. Judging from the progression of his illness, he wouldn't survive the night. Peter's mood seemed to calm down a bit when he saw his brother arrive, but he still didn't say a word. However, just as Julia was drawing blood for Peter, he suddenly lashed out and attacked Alan and Julia. Fortunately, the 2 reacted quickly, joined forces to subdue him, and administered a sedative in time, which allowed them to narrowly escape disaster. Shortly after that, the 2 went to examine the other 2 deceased infected people, and the sight before them was even more chilling. The deceased had turned into skeletons, with traces of the used black blood still remaining on their bodies. Alan and his team members had never seen such a strange virus before. They realized they had to launch research immediately to find the pathogen as soon as possible. Later, Alan went to Peter's room to look for any potentially useful clues, where he found Peter's work diary. While reviewing the videos attached to the diary, he keenly noticed that his brother had made a gesture that only the 2 of them understood. It meant escape. This discovery made Alan tense inwardly. He vaguely felt that there seemed to be more unknown secrets hidden behind this viral crisis. But unexpectedly, Peter actually did escape. A hole had been broken in the isolation room's ceiling, allowing him to crawl through and get away. For the safety of the laboratory staff, Dr. Sonata decided to inject toxic gas into the pipelines, sacrificing Peter to secure the safety of others. But Alan insisted that he also enter the pipelines. He wanted to bring back his brother's body. After he entered the pipelines, he soon heard a noise. He followed the sound only to find that it wasn't his brother, but a member of the security team. This person's palm, where the access chip was located, had been cut off, obviously taken by Peter. This meant that everyone in the base was now in danger. On the other side, Doran went to the laboratory intending to conduct live experiments, but unexpectedly, such a large research institute had no monkeys to use as test subjects, so she had to use mice for the experiments instead. Doran discovered that the virus wasn't transmitted through the air, but just as her assistant John was taking samples in the sewer pipes, he accidentally found monkey hair. It was clear that the laboratory staff had lied, so the 2 searched around the laboratory and found a room they couldn't enter. John used his military knowledge to open the door, and upon entering, he found that the room was filled with cages for holding monkeys. Obviously, there must have been hundreds or even thousands of monkeys here before. Just when they thought no monkeys had survived here, a monkey suddenly appeared and attacked Doran. Fortunately, John reacted in time and shot it dead. But this also made Doran realize that this monkey was the pathogen. At the same time, after Sarah and Julia conducted research on the virus, they discovered that the virus was only 15 nanometers in size. There are no records of this virus in existing databases. Therefore, Julia informed Alan of this news. Little did they know that John, who had just discovered the monkey that was the pathogen, had taken advantage of everyone's inattention to bring a small microtransmitter outside the base. And no one knew who he was sending the signal to, and on this ice-covered snowy ground, there were actually hundreds or thousands of frozen monkeys. But John didn't tell anyone about this news. Upon returning to the laboratory, Dr. Sonata seemed to know about John's recent actions, and even talked to him about his employer. Alan and the other 2 in the research room discovered that the virus is actually mutable. The reason why Peter is still alive is that he underwent a gene mutation after being infected by the virus. At this moment, Peter showed no signs of dying and was wandering around the base, and began attacking scientists one after another using the severed access hand. Soon, 5 people were attacked. but Peter only forcibly kissed them and didn't harm them. Obviously, Peter intended to spread the virus on a large scale, since the regeneration rate of the virus cells has now become 6, excluding the 3 infected people who have already been captured. 2 people escaped during the arrest, so according to Alan's calculation, there should be 18 new infected cases. Alan hoped to find a way to persuade them to surrender, but for the safety of the base, Dr. Sanada insisted that force must be used in case of emergencies. During this same period, Doran, who was dissecting the monkey, encountered an infected person. Although the person didn't attack Doran, he kept shouting words like escape, and also said that he was a liar. Doran originally wanted to take the opportunity to escape, but was almost attacked by a female infected person. Fortunately, she finally fainted and fell to the ground. Meanwhile, one of the isolated people was in extreme agony at this moment. Sarah couldn't bear to watch, so she went to the warehouse to get sedatives for them, but unexpectedly, Peter appeared here, but he didn't attack Sarah. Instead, he said Dr. Sanada's name. Immediately after that, he jumped into the ventilation duct again. After learning about this incident, Alan believed that his brother was controlling his emotions, and they must find him as soon as possible now. So John climbed into the ventilation duct again to start searching, while Alan used the monitors to conduct real-time monitoring. But unexpectedly, John was suddenly attacked by Peter, and the location was right above Alan. Although John wasn't infected, Peter escaped again. On the other side, after reviewing Peter's previous research videos, Julia unexpectedly discovered that Peter had actually been using himself to research a new reagent, and decided to repeat his experiment using mice, and the result was surprising. Reagent A caused a mouse to turn into black blood and die. The mouse injected with reagent B was unharmed, but its body was covered with black blood vessels, and it became extremely aggressive. At this time, the 3 isolated experts had become extremely irritable, and even held Sarah hostage. To calm them down, Alan took the initiative to enter the isolation room, and soothe their emotions with sincere words. As soon as the 2 escaped danger, Julia told Alan about her discovery. Realizing the situation was dangerous, he asked Julia and Sarah to go back and monitor the infected people. At the same time, one expert seemed to have discovered the base's secret, and tried to leave on a snowmobile. When John found out and saw that dissuasion was useless, he took a knife and killed the expert. From all these incidents, Alan realized that Dr. Sanada must be hiding something from him, but he wanted Dr. Sanada to tell him the whole truth. However, for some unknown reason, Dr. Sanada refused to reveal anything, and another accident happened soon after. While Julia was taking a shower, Peter found her and forcibly kissed her. When Alan found Julia, she had already collapsed to the ground, but she thought she had hallucinated earlier and couldn't remember the attack. Alan was worried about leaving her alone in the room, so he stood guard outside the door, but suddenly, he heard a strange sound coming from the pipeline. He followed the sound to a laboratory and unexpectedly saw Peter inside. After saying "Save me," Peter fainted. At this time on the base, many scientists who might have been infected were isolated, but there were still 3 people at large. This made everyone feel scared. Just then, Alan carried the unconscious Peter into the laboratory, but when they saw this scene, the expressions in Dr. Sanada, John, and others' eyes became solemn. Dr. Sanada made an excuse that for safety reasons, Peter needed to be isolated in a safer place, so he took Alan to the second basement floor. This place was once used for nuclear fusion project experiments, so it is particularly strong and safe, and can also be used as a research site. So Alan proposed using the entire floor as an isolation area, transferring the infected people here, and keeping normal people upstairs, to prevent the virus from spreading further. But just then, the female infected person, who had escaped suddenly appeared in front of them, asking for help. The security guards actually shot and injured her. Fortunately, Alan took emergency measures and saved her life, and demanded that she be transferred to the nuclear fusion laboratory immediately. Later, Alan told several people about his decision. Sarah was to conduct tests to check if anyone was infected, while Doran was to conduct research on the monkey. But unexpectedly, when she arrived at the dissection room, she found that the monkey had disappeared without a trace. She originally wanted to go and argue with Dr. Sanada, but John stopped her, and took her outside the base to take samples from the monkeys here. But Doran was curious about how John knew this place. When she saw he was about to leave, John could only say that he had known about it for a long time, and that the military had ordered him to keep the base's matters confidential. This dispelled Doran's doubts. She planned to take the blood samples back, to replicate more of the virus for research. However, while they were conducting the experiment, something terrifying happened. The virus actually began to reproduce at an extremely fast rate, as if it were a living organism. Doran immediately wanted to go and question Dr. Sanada about what kind of research he was really doing, but John stopped her again, saying he didn't want to be turned into an ice sculpture and left outside. At this time, Alan was putting pressure on Dr. Sanada. After he brought back the other 2 infected people, he learned from them that the base was developing a new antidote, something Dr. Sanada had never told him about. Under his pressure, he finally learned from Dr. Sanada that the base was developing a panacea that could cure all viruses, but these two drugs were unstable. Drug A had a 100% mortality rate, and the mortality rate of drug B was also as high as 80%. On the other side, Sarah quickly developed a reagent for testing infection. If the drop turned green on the body, it meant the result was positive. So while Sarah was away, Julia used herself as a test subject. Fortunately, the color of the reagent didn't change, which put her at ease. They quickly tested those scientists and isolated the infected people with positive results. But during this period, that female infected person suddenly became violent and attacked the guards, then escaped from the isolation room and began to attack scientists frantically. As Julia watched this scene, she finally remembered what had happened to her in the bathroom, and in the next second, she even spat out a mouthful of black blood. She took the initiative to go to the isolation floor, but suddenly she remembered that the color of her reagent hadn't changed, which meant the test had failed. She wanted to call Alan to inform him, but the communication was cut off. It turned out that Alan, unable to control the current situation, wanted to use a military satellite to contact the troops, but unexpectedly, upon hearing this news, Dr. Sonata and John's expressions turned gloomy again. Shortly after, the satellite receiver near the base was blown up with a bomb. In the blink of an eye, for days past, the people on the second floor lost communication and had almost no food left. Everyone thought Alan and the others had abandoned them. They even wanted to perish together with the people upstairs by turning off the air filters. It would only take 6 hours to deplete all the air upstairs. Julia certainly disagreed with this approach and was excluded by the others, but unexpectedly, right after she was driven out of the laboratory, she saw a mysterious person in a protective suit waving at her continuously. But when she followed, she found there was nothing in the corridor. Now that 4 days had passed, the satellite receiver still hadn't been repaired. Alan had run out of patience, especially since the people on the second floor were in urgent need of help. But Dr. Sonata didn't give in and planned to keep the infected people downstairs. Under such circumstances, the only option was to develop the antidote quickly, so Alan planned to continue experimenting on his brother. Seeing how much his brother was suffering, he decided to test the newly developed virus inhibitor, but that drug hadn't been tested yet, and it was dangerous to use it rashly. But Alan didn't care about that anymore and directly injected Peter with it. Soon, Peter calmed down and regained consciousness. While the two were communicating, Sarah found Alan and told him about her discovery that the test was inaccurate, but she concealed the fact that the doctor had been infected. Shortly after Sarah left the isolation room, she suddenly felt unwell. It turned out that she had undergone tumor surgery, and her body had not yet fully recovered. In the end, she found morphine in the warehouse, and barely managed to control the situation. At the isolation room, Alan learned from his brother that the reason he had come here was that he wanted to prove himself, and coupled with the fact that Dr. Sonata had threatened him with Julia, which led to this outcome. But right after he finished saying this, Peter's heart stopped beating completely. Although he was rescued, he was now in a vegetative state. But during this period, those severely infected people had turned into ferocious zombies. Julia was almost attacked, but fortunately, she was helped by another doctor, Anna, and narrowly escaped danger. In order to keep going, they found supplies to survive on in the warehouse, but unexpectedly, there were marks carved by Julia behind the shelves, which meant that she had been here at some point she couldn't remember. At this time, the people on the second floor had started to take action. As they watched, the air on the floor was getting thinner and thinner. Dr. Sonata took his assistant down to negotiate with those people. He persuaded the 3 resistors, saying that he would find a way to keep them alive. As soon as the 3 lowered their guard, Dr. Sonata shot them dead, and told his assistant to dispose of the bodies while he went to look for Julia. When he arrived on the second floor, he happened to encounter a zombie-infected person. Unexpectedly, the zombie didn't attack Dr. Sonata. Instead, it hid in fear to the side. On the other side, Doran was still researching the virus, and after several days, she finally achieved some success. But unexpectedly, just as she was about to go, report, John killed her and then disguised it as an accident. Shortly after, John went outside the base again, poured gasoline, and set a fire that burned all the monkeys to death. Then he took out his phone and sent a text message to the employer behind the scenes, saying the mission was completed. Unexpectedly, the other party refused to let him evacuate, and demanded that he bring back a doctor named Zach. So he went to Dr. Sonata's office, and searched for information about Zach on his computer, but found no relevant information. Just at this moment, the assistant walked in. John wanted to find out about Zach from him, but unexpectedly, the assistant didn't know either and asked John to leave the office. Dr. Sonata still didn't know his office had been trespassed into. He faked an injury on the second floor, then found Julia and Anna, and lied, saying that he had wanted to deliver supplies to the people on the second floor, but was accidentally attacked. There is still an emergency passage that can get through this floor, but it's very dangerous to get through. But the kind-hearted Julia still decided to help him. The two supported Dr. Sonata and arrived at the emergency passage. But unexpectedly, they were attacked by a swarm of rats. In the end, only Dr. Sanada and Julia escaped into the laboratory next to the corridor. After resting for a while, the two prepared to move on, only to be attacked by zombie-infected people. In the nick of time, Anna appeared and saved them both. It turned out that Anna hadn't died in the earlier accident. The two worked together to perform a simple operation on Dr. Sanada, but unexpectedly, the next second, Anna repeated the conversation that Julia and Dr. Sanada had just had. It turned out that Anna was just Julia's hallucination, and everything that had just happened was actually Julia acting alone. At the same time, Alan finally found Doran, who had had an accident. Judging from the scene, it seemed to be an accident. But Alan didn't think so, because Doran had a physical examination every year. It was impossible for her to suddenly have a health issue that led to an accident. Alan finally lost control of his emotions. He believed that the biggest problem now wasn't the virus, but the hidden secrets inside this base. Under the guidance of the assistant, they checked the previous surveillance footage of the laboratory, only to find that the footage had been deliberately deleted. Even though the footage was gone, the assistant was certain that John was the one who did it. After Alan left, he found John's figure in the surveillance footage. He found the bald doctor who was collaborating with Alan. The doctor knew about Zach, but it seemed that he couldn't have contact with others due to illness, so no one knew where he was being held. Just then, the assistant found the bald doctor, and threatened him to quickly clean up all traces. So John went to the mortuary, and found Alan still conducting an autopsy on Doran, and that Alan had already found the needle mark on Doran's neck. On the other side, Sarah returned to her room, and found that the doctor was gone. When she went to look for her, she found the doctor's condition had worsened. She was even dancing in the corridor. Sarah went forward to talk to her, but was almost attacked unexpectedly. Although the doctor finally calmed down, the situation became more and more critical. Especially at this moment, Alan found her, and told her that Doran had been murdered. However, he also found out that Sarah had been taking large amounts of morphine. He thought she was abusing drugs and was very angry about it, and told her she had to stop this behavior. After leaving Sarah's side, John found Alan and lied, saying there was a doctor named Zach, who had been helping Doran with her research, and that Zach seemed to know the secrets about the base. So Alan went to question the assistant, but the assistant shifted the blame to John, believing that John was sowing discord. So the two went to search John's room together and found plastic explosives, as well as a small satellite receiver, and the phone he used to communicate with his employer behind the scenes. Just as Alan was shocked, he turned around and found that the assistant was gone. At this moment, the assistant had gone outside the base and into the icy snow. After raising a mysterious device, a container holding Dr. Zach appeared in front of him, but the next second, John appeared behind him, knocked him unconscious and took the container away. On his way back, he encountered Alan, who was searching for him. Seeing that the other party had discovered his secret, John kicked him out. Fortunately, Alan was lucky enough to survive. However, just as John was about to send a text to his employer, the recovered assistant killed John and took the container. But that night, John's body was dragged away by a mysterious person. The next day, Alan still didn't know that John had been taken away by the mysterious person, and demanded that the assistant find John quickly. After returning to the base, Sarah pushed the doctor, who had already died, to Alan. Now Alan had only one thought, and that was to hurry back to the second floor and bring Julia back. But how could the assistant agree to his plan? He threatened Alan to go back and continue his research. Forced by the other party's threat of force, Alan could only agree on the surface. Now that John was missing and Doran was dead, Julia was his only hope, so he decided to find a way to go down to the second floor. At the same time, Julia's hallucinations became more and more severe. She started having dreams, dreaming of herself as a child and even seeing Peter, who was unharmed. When she woke up again, the screams coming from outside the door made her hug herself and cry in fear. When she came to her senses, she found that the signs of infection on her body were becoming more and more serious. She forced herself to stay conscious and showed her wound to Dr. Sanada. By this time, Dr. Sanada had woken up. Julia wanted to know why Dr. Sanada hadn't told her that Anna was an illusion, but Dr. Sanada thought that given Julia's current situation, having a fake friend might be beneficial for her condition with the infection. But as soon as he finished speaking, Julia's condition flared up again, and she finally fainted. To free Julia from suffering, Dr. Sanada injected her with a can of red medicine to put her into a coma. Then he secretly left through a secret passage. On the other side of the room, Alan and Sarah snuck into the second floor, but the door in front of them was locked with a chain. He originally wanted to saw through it with a saw, but the arrival of a group of zombies almost got both of them infected. They had to temporarily abandon this plan. They went back to continue their research on the virus, and discovered that the virus was actually man-made, and it also contained some kind of strange substance. Just then, Dr. Sanada also returned, so Alan found him to question him, but Dr. Sanada said that all of this was to treat incurable diseases. Seeing that he couldn't get any more information, Alan had to find the truth by himself. Shortly after, the assistant told Dr. Sanada that he had taken care of John, but Dr. Sanada was worried that this would bring even bigger trouble. Little did they know that John hadn't died, but was locked up at home by Nana, the only sheriff in the Arctic. The reason she arrested John was to investigate everything about the laboratory. She took John to her room. Here, there were photos of all the children who had gone missing in the past 20 years, all of whom were related to the base. That's why she was so eager to find out about the base. In the afternoon, John finally managed to unlock the handcuffs with great effort. Unexpectedly, he saw Nana meeting with the assistant. What was unexpected? This guy wasn't the assistant, he was Nana's younger brother Tony. It turned out Nana had two younger brothers, one of whom went missing when they were kids, and it was clear that the assistant was that missing brother. On the other side, after research, Alan and Sarah found Doran's previous experimental results, and discovered that these viruses could be killed by ultra-low temperatures, so he tested this on his brother and found that it really worked, but the temperature wasn't low enough yet. Sarah remembered that the G-floor seemed to be used for cryoprecipitation experiments, so there might be a solution there. So Alan found Dr. Ed. Unexpectedly, with Dr. Ed's help, Peter's condition really improved. Dr. Sanada and the assistant were both monitoring them from outside. Dr. Sanada wasn't surprised at all by their progress, he just wanted to see John's body with his own eyes right now. When the two arrived at the snowy ground, they were shocked to find that John's body was gone. But just then, several helicopters suddenly arrived at the base, and when Dr. Sanada saw the markings on them, his expression turned solemn in an instant. At the same time, Julia finally woke up, but her eyes had turned a strange white color. Fortunately, all the infection on her body had been cured. Soon, a group of fully armed soldiers got off the helicopters. The woman leading them was Susan, the person in charge of the group that secretly sponsored the base. She had come here specially, but didn't offer any help. To make matters worse, the helicopters flew away right after dropping her off, and wouldn't be back for 2 days. She demanded that the virus antidote be developed immediately, and said Alan could make any request he wanted for this, and Alan has only one condition, which is to bring Julia with him. Upon hearing this, Susan agreed immediately. Later, she talked to Dr. Sanada alone. It turned out that the purpose of her sponsoring the base was to have both the virus and the antidote developed together. But so far, Dr. Sanada had only created the virus. She gave Dr. Sanada a few days, and if the antidote still wasn't developed by then, everyone in the base would die. Alan also noticed that Susan seemed to be hiding something, so he decided to hide the antidote after developing it, keeping it as a backup. Moreover, he also strongly demanded to go to the second floor together with Susan's troops. Little did he know that during this time, John and Nana had already arrived at the base gate. When the assistant saw that John was still alive, he immediately opened the base gate. Nana rushed to hug her brother as soon as she saw him, and took out photos of herself and her brother. The assistant was in disbelief and had someone take John into custody, while he interrogated Nana alone. Later, he took Nana to a room. When he saw the childhood photos and the true affection Nana showed, he finally realized that Dr. Sanada, the one who had adopted him, was the culprit who had abducted him. At this time, Julia, who had already recovered, believed that her blood might be the key to developing the antidote, so she decided to find a way to return to the upper floors, but she encountered zombies on the way. However, unexpectedly, when the zombies saw Julia's pupils, they were so scared that they ran away immediately. It was obvious that there was some kind of secret hidden within her. Not long after the zombies left, Dr. Sanada actually returned here. He had learned from Susan that they were planning to find Julia, and was worried that Julia would be in danger, so he decided to take her away first. When he heard that Julia's infection had been cured, and that there was an abnormality in her eyes, Dr. Sanada was so moved that he shed tears. He used his sincere feelings to persuade Julia to leave with him. Meanwhile, Susan's main force was already ready. Since Susan and her team had never seen what the infected looked like either, they arrived at the second floor fully armed. As they went deeper, a group of zombies rushed out. Their combat effectiveness was simply unstoppable. Susan immediately abandoned the plan to find Julia, and withdrew to the upper floor. At this time, Julia had been taken back to Dr. Sanada's office, but as soon as she came out, she was blocked at the door by the assistant and Nana. The assistant had someone take Julia away. Before leaving, Dr. Sanada handed a pair of contact lenses to Julia. Julia, who was taken back to the laboratory, soon met Alan, who had just returned from the second floor. The two hugged tightly and wept tears of joy. But what no one knew was that the zombies on the second floor had already sneaked into their floor through the ventilation ducts, and were secretly monitoring them. Julia believed that they could now use her blood to develop the antidote, but Alan disagreed, thinking it was too risky at the moment. At this moment, the alarm suddenly went off. Unexpectedly, the zombies had attacked the supply warehouse. This was no longer a simple attack, but an organized and premeditated operation. But, surprisingly, Susan didn't panic at all when she found out. Instead, she let things continue to develop, wanting to see what the zombies would do next. On the other side, Alan found the tied-up Dr. Sanada, and wanted to know what he had done to Julia on the second floor, and whether he had already developed the antidote. but Dr. Sanada told him that Julia had recovered from the infection on her own, but this also made her extremely dangerous. She would most likely be captured by the group, and used for research for the rest of her life. As expected, when Alan returned, Susan had already placed Julia under house arrest. Now this woman was the property of the group and no longer had freedom. However, how could Julia just wait for her fate? She found the ventilation duct in the room and planned to escape through it, but now the duct was full of those zombies. She soon encountered 2 of them, but strangely, the zombies didn't attack Julia. The guards soon discovered her escape and reported it to Susan. At this time, Julia had already climbed to the top of Alan's laboratory and contacted the 2 via walkie-talkie. Alan asked Julia to rescue Dr. Sanada and then help him take back control of the base, but after Julia untied Dr. Sanada actually knocked her unconscious with a sedative. When she woke up again, she found that she was holding half a photo in her hand. The photo showed her as a child standing with Dr. Sanada himself. At the same time, Alan tricked the guards into believing he had developed the antidote, luring Susan to the laboratory. Little did she know that what they had made was a chemical bomb. With the explosion of the bomb, the 2 quickly escaped and hid in another laboratory. But unexpectedly, Susan didn't die. She only suffered minor injuries. She used Peter to threaten Alan into surrendering. At this moment, Sarah found a sonic weapon that could temporarily disable the people on the opposite side. So Alan pretended to surrender and walked up to Susan. When they let their guard down, Sarah secretly activated the sonic weapon, disabling the 2 guards. As the laboratory lost power, zombie-infected people jumped down from the ventilation ducts, knocked out 1 guard, and took Peter away. Alan could only watch as Peter was taken. Dr. Sanada also arrived in time. With Dr. Sanada's help, they escaped from the laboratory with Sarah and the others. Originally, Dr. Sanada wanted to take the 3 of them to another floor, but when they returned to the office, they found Julia was gone again. She had been taken away again by Susan's men, so they decided to split up. Alan would go to rescue Julia, while Dr. Sanada would go to kill Susan. Just as Susan was about to evacuate with Julia, Dr. Sanada arrived at her room, killed Susan by force, and took over the base. Julia was also successfully rescued. Dr. Sanada also put Susan's head in a container and sealed it. The next day, they used Sarah as bait and captured a zombie as an experimental subject. But what was strange now was that all the zombies on the 2nd floor had disappeared without a trace. Soon, Alan found a tunnel leading underground, but logically, the base should only have 24 underground floors. Under Alan's questioning, Dr. Sanada told the truth. It turned out there was a 25th underground floor beneath them. That was the virus warehouse, which held the original virus samples. He then told everyone that the group had ordered him to create the apocalypse virus. If he hadn't delayed the development of the antidote, the entire world would have already fallen into doomsday. But their current situation wasn't good either. Through the surveillance, everyone found that the zombies seemed to have started acting in a group. They surrounded Peter's body in the center, and as they took the black blood, Peter actually came back to life. And all the zombies submitted to him. At most, the group would find out what had happened here in 2 days, and send troops over. They had to destroy the apocalypse virus before that, so Alan decided to let Dr. Sanada and Sarah go to shut down the base's temperature control system, while he and Julia would head to the 25th underground floor to destroy the virus and freeze the zombies. As the base's temperature dropped, Alan and Julia immediately arrived at the 25th floor and found it packed with zombies. Fortunately, the low temperature had disabled the zombies. After making their way through the horde of zombies, the 2 reached the virus warehouse. This place housed every type of virus in the world. If they were to leak out, the world would be completely doomed. But just as they were destroying the virus, Sarah's spinal tumor suddenly flared up. Dr. Sanada had to restart the temperature control system immediately. This caused all the zombies to start waking up. The 2 had to escape while the zombies were still not fully conscious, but right after they stepped out, Julia spotted a passage leading deep underground. When she went down to check, she was shocked to find it looked exactly like her childhood home. The 2 didn't have time to uncover the truth, and had to return to the laboratory first. But unexpectedly, they ran into Peter leading a group of zombies as soon as they went back up. In the end, it was Julia who used the intimidating aura from her white pupils to help them escape safely. The 2 immediately found Dr. Sanada, but seeing how critical Sarah's condition was, they didn't have time to ask questions and rushed to start her treatment. During this time, Julia sought out Dr. Sanada alone and finally learned the truth. It turned out she was his biological daughter, and their identical eyes were the best proof of this. But because he had abducted those Inuit children, his wife took their daughter away after finding out, which kept them from seeing each other all these years. Julia wanted to know why her eyes looked like this, but Dr. Sanada still refused to tell the whole truth, which left Julia still unable to trust him. On the other side, Alan discovered that Sarah's tumor had already started to spread, and it was only a matter of time before it reached her brain. Alan was powerless to do anything about it. After learning about the relationship between Julia and Dr. Sanada, he went to question Dr. Sanada, but this matter wasn't the priority right now. for Dr. Sanada had seen through surveillance that Ed had actually taken the apocalypse virus, and Ed had even escaped from the base. If the virus were to leave the Arctic, the world would plunge into doomsday. He and Julia used satellite to locate an abandoned monitoring station nearby, so the two set off for the station in the heavy snow. Sure enough, they found Ed hiding there. Unexpectedly, this guy was driven by sheer greed, and planned to hand over the virus to the group in exchange for a reward. Fortunately, Alan and Julia arrived just in time, and managed to take Ed into custody. The two split their tasks and worked together. Alan found the backup generator and turned on the lights, but Julia couldn't fix the radio no matter how hard she tried, making it impossible to call for help. However, just at this moment, a mysterious man actually launched an attack. First, he killed Ed and also destroyed the radio equipment. At the critical moment when their lives were at stake, Alan unexpectedly found an underground passage. The two hid in it, only to find a man with a pale face and the same pupils as Julia here. The man seemed to have lost his mind, but he remembered that he had been trapped here for 30 years. Moreover, the two learned from him that beings like him and Julia were called immortals, who could survive for 40 days even without food, and could even be resurrected after death, and would gain eternal life after dying more than 10,000 times. But this was like a kind of torture for the man, so he ended his own life with the help of the two. But just at this moment, the sniper from not far away also found them and took them hostage. But right at this moment, the assistant arrived here and rescued them. After being freed, the two set fire to the monitoring station and burned it down, then headed back to the base. At the same time, under Dr. Sanada's guidance, Sarah conducted research on Julia's chromosomes, and found that Julia's DNA seemed to be able to strengthen her own immune system, to target the tumor directly, so she decided to inject Julia's bone marrow fluid into her own body, but the result was unsuccessful. When Alan and Julia returned to the base, Sarah was already unconscious. They told Dr. Sanada about the man they had met. It turned out that the man had betrayed Julia's mother, and defected to the group back then, so Dr. Sanada had trapped him there as punishment, and the 500 people the man mentioned were the 500 immortals who controlled the group. Before the two could process this shocking news, Sarah's condition began to deteriorate, and she could only hold on for a maximum of a few hours. Now they had to take a desperate gamble. Julia injected her own blood into Sarah's body, pulling her out of danger, and Sarah quickly recovered her health. But another danger was approaching. Dr. Sanada received a text message from the group, stating that at least 100 armed soldiers would attack the base, so to deal with this trouble, he planted bombs in various areas of the base. Later, he told Alan this news, planning to take all the survivors to the bunker he had built before, which was exactly the home Julia and Alan had discovered. There was a passage there that led directly to the ground. When the group's people arrived, he would detonate the bombs, making those people and the base vanish into thin air together. But an even worse situation was unfolding. People in the base began to go missing. Peter, leading his zombie subordinates, started capturing all of them. They used these people as test subjects and drained their blood completely. After collecting a large amount of blood containing the infectious virus, they poured the blood into the water reservoir, because Alan had housed all the scientists in the same room for their safety. This just gave the zombies an opportunity. They sprinkled all the blood through the pipes. When Alan returned here, everyone had already been infected. Now, only Alan and a few others were left as survivors. At this moment, Alan suddenly thought of the test they had done the previous day. They had mixed the semi-finished antidote with coolant, and first tested it on mice, and found that it could eliminate the virus. So the two immortals, Sanada and Julia, put on protective suits, and went to the second floor with the antidote. They soon encountered Peter. After using the coolant to restrict his movements, Julia immediately injected him with the antidote, restoring him to normal. Soon, all the infected people were injected with the antidote. Those people were all placed in one room, waiting for the virus to fade away. But the base's alarm suddenly went off. It was clear that the group's troops had arrived here. Alan and the others took their weapons and prepared to go out and fight, but when the snowmobiles drove up to them, they found that there was no one on them, and bombs had even been installed on them. Sanada didn't dodge in time and was caught in the explosion. Alan and the others immediately returned to the bunker, while the real special forces had already entered the base via airborne insertion. Sanada was extremely nervous now, because he knew what kind of figure the group had sent. The man leading them, known as Scythe, was the group's most terrifying assassin. Realizing they couldn't delay any longer, the assistant immediately pressed the bomb button, but unexpectedly, the expected explosion didn't happen. It turned out that Scythe and his two subordinates had anticipated all this, and had brought devices that block bomb signals in advance, and Scythe's mission this time, apart from retrieving the virus and the antidote, was also to capture Sanada alive and kill everyone else inside the bunker. After the assistant went up to check the situation, though he didn't know where Scythe and the other two had gone, Alan guessed that they might be hiding in the shadows, monitoring them, so he and Sanada, along with a few others, returned to the upper floors to draw attention, while Julia and the others stayed inside the bunker. Sure enough, Scythe was watching all this on the other side of the monitor at this moment. Moreover, he also discovered the video of Sanada killing Susan, which made him fly into a rage. Because Susan was his mother, so Scythe started to take action to avenge her. He saw that Sonata and Alan were preparing to organize a few people to leave the base, and braved the heavy snow to go to the place where the containers were stored, and followed them all the way. When Sonata saw Scythe, he knew he was no match for him, so to attract attention, he threw the antidote onto the snow nearby. Scythe's subordinate was about to pick it up, but the ground suddenly collapsed, and thus fell into the bottomless abyss. It turned out that all this was Alan and the others' plan. They originally intended to catch Scythe by this means, but unexpectedly, they found that Scythe had disappeared, the plan failed, and the base had become dangerous, so they needed to return to the bunker to think about the next plan. At this time, Scythe and his subordinate Bali learned through the monitor that there was actually Sonata's daughter in this base, so they decided to use this weakness to act. Just at this moment, Alan and the others were preparing to go to the laboratory to take the antidote, but a power outage suddenly occurred when they were taking the elevator. Although the emergency power supply was activated, Julia had disappeared. They could only return to the bunker to look for a chance to get rescue, but unexpectedly, Scythe dropped a can, inside which was obviously a severed finger of Julia and a threatening letter, so they decided to split up and act. Sonata would go to attract attention, while Alan and Peter would carry out the rescue through the pipeline. However, during this period, the assistant actually acted without authorization, resulting in him also being captured by Scythe. When Sonata came before Scythe, the latter gave him a cruel choice. One was to save his own biological daughter, and the other was to save his adopted son. Sonata was very torn about this, but unexpectedly, the assistant chose to sacrifice himself for his adoptive father. The sudden accident distracted Scythe, giving Sonata a chance. Alan and Peter also arrived in time and subdued Scythe, but unexpectedly, the escaped Bali still had a backup plan. She opened the container she had brought, inside which was obviously Julia's mother. In order to find out where exactly Julia's mother was being held, Alan and Peter started interrogating Scythe, but unexpectedly, the latter not only refused to say anything, but also told them to watch the news. To everyone's surprise, for some unknown reason, the virus from the base had actually spread. An epidemic had already broken out in Lares, Puerto Rico. Hundreds of people had been infected, and no one knew how many had died. They found Dr. Sonata, but Dr. Sonata seemed equally surprised by this result, and had no idea how the virus had spread. But the top priority now was to find his wife, Linda. According to the base's layout, the best place for surveillance was the security room on the ground floor. They must have set up an operation base there, so they asked Peter to stay behind to monitor the situation, while the other three went to the operation base. But unexpectedly, when they arrived, they found John, who had been captured by Bali, but John had already knocked Bali unconscious, and his only purpose for coming here was to get the list of the abducted children. After rescuing Irene, Dr. Sonata wrote down the list and handed it to him. After John left, Dr. Sonata handed both the antidote and the virus to Alan, but during this time, Peter quietly went to the isolation room where Scythe was detained. Unexpectedly, Peter had also defected to the group. His goal was to become an immortal. He wanted to gain the ability of immortality, outlive his elder brother, and then live happily ever after with Julia, so he deliberately put on a show with Scythe and let him escape. At the same time, Julia was trying her best to restore her mother's consciousness, because Irene had been captured for too long. Her memories were stuck in the time when Julia was a child, and she didn't recognize any of these people. Just then, the base's alarm went off again. Dr. Sonata and Alan took their weapons and went to the door to check, only to find that it was Nana and her brother. They had come to assist the assistant, but unfortunately, the assistant was no longer there. Before they could recover from their sorrow, Peter, with injuries all over his face, came to Alan and told them that Scythe had escaped. So everyone didn't dare to delay and prepared to evacuate. At this time, the doctor who had helped Sarah do the blood test also found her, and told her the news that she was pregnant, and the father of the child was Alan. But given the current situation, she had no time to tell Alan the news, because the moment Alan opened the door, Scythe appeared holding a bomb remote control. As he pressed the button, the entire base was destroyed in an instant. Many scientists also lost their lives in the fire, and Julia was held hostage by Scythe. He planned to take Julia away with him. Alan hurried to chase them, and jumped onto the helicopter just as it was taking off. But for the sake of hope in the future, Julia chose to sacrifice herself. She handed all the containers of the virus and the antidote to Alan, and then pushed him off the helicopter. More than 200 days passed in the blink of an eye. By this time, Alan had learned the news that Julia was still alive, and had found her location according to the address. But what he didn't know was that Julia wasn't being abused. On the contrary, she looked radiant, and seemed to have even become a leader among the immortals of the group. Season 1 of Helix was released in 2014, and was billed as the strongest sci-fi drama in history. It also received quite high ratings on major platforms. One of the most praiseworthy aspects of Season 1 is its attention to detail. Details are subtly woven throughout the plot, rather than deliberately presenting key clues that drive the plot development. For example, the opening setting where information is injected into the palm for authorization purposes echoes the later plot, where the protagonist's brother cuts off a security guard's palm. More subtly, there is a detail of a call and response in the background sound, when the protagonist enters his brother's bedroom, implying that the security guard has lost contact, and may have been attacked. Such delicate touches that require repeated viewing by the audience to detect, are truly rare in today's sci-fi dramas. Season 1 of Helix successfully creates a sense of oppression in a confined space. The entire story mainly takes place in a research base in the Arctic. The isolated environment, the threat of an unknown virus, and the gradually mutating and infected population, all make the plot extremely tense. To some extent, the series has a tendency to lean towards zombie movies, but it is not entirely equivalent to the traditional zombie genre. The horror of the viral infection lies not only in physical mutations, but also in the collapse and reconstruction of human nature in the face of fear. The character relationships in the show are complex and full of tension. The initially portrayed villain is later revealed to be a good father protecting his daughter, while the seemingly upright adopted son is actually a child who was abducted by villains and then adopted. The protagonist's younger brother not only had an affair with his sister-in-law, but is also a hypocrite who puts on a moral facade and wants to make a name for himself by defeating his brother. However, character development is also an aspect of Season 1 of Helix that may spark controversy, perhaps due to the director's over-pursuit of perfection in details. The interactions and dialogues between characters sometimes seem stiff and abrupt, although the dialogues are information-dense, with almost no unnecessary words. This also makes the character portrayal seem less natural in some cases. However, for sci-fi dramas, the handling of emotional scenes usually requires more tolerance from the audience. Season 1 of Helix may not immediately attract all viewers at the start. Some people may find the first few episodes a bit boring, but the show indeed has the potential to become a masterpiece. As a sci-fi drama, the intricacy with which it weaves its story, and the originality of its sci-fi concepts, are both worthy of praise. If you can be patient enough to watch up to the 5th or 6th episode, you may, like many viewers, begin to understand and immerse yourself in this complex story. If you persist until the end of the season, and see the ending where the base is blown up, the little girl is abducted by a mysterious young boy, and the team leaves the Arctic, you will most likely be eager to continue watching the second season. Season 1 of Helix not only makes bold innovations in its sci-fi concepts, but also sets a new standard in attention to detail, proving that TV dramas can also have film-level sophisticated storytelling.